South Africa is one of 5 countries participating in the Global Children's Vaccine Trial. The South African Health Products Authority and the World Health Organization have approved the trial, and some 2,000 South African children are taking part in the trial, with children aged between 6 months and 17 years. Joining us via Zoom is virologist Professor Shabir Mahdi for a little bit more on this. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you, Prof. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
All right, just before we get into the children, I do want to get a little bit of clarity in terms of the vaccines and the deaths and those that are vaccinated, not vaccinated. We heard from the previous report that nobody's died as a result of the vaccine that they received. Does that mean that because the president last night was saying there's a small percentage of people who have died after being vaccinated. So the vaccine doesn't prevent you getting COVID-19. It reduces your chances of getting hospitalization. But there's no one who's died as a result of the vaccine. Is that what the clarity that we need here?
Correct. So there's a few things. Firstly, the vaccine does protect you from getting COVID-19. But the protection against being infected with the virus is only about 50%. In contrast, the effectiveness of the vaccine in preventing you from being hospitalized is above 90% for a Pfizer vaccine and probably about 70% for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But vaccine does also protect infection, and even a 50% lower risk of being infected with the virus, when compounded, results in a huge number of additional cases being prevented because those people won't spread the virus onwards.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to the deaths that's being experienced after people have been vaccinated, as you indicated in an insert, there's a number of reasons why those deaths are occurring. Those 86 deaths that have been reported post-vaccination, they've been investigated. There's been a review of the medical records, and the conclusion from that review by NICEC, which is a safety committee that's reviewing all of these deaths, was that none of those deaths were due to vaccination, but rather there were other biological reasons that explained the death, including amongst a few that actually died of COVID-19, largely because they weren't fully immunized and the vaccines hadn't yet kicked in terms of conferring adequate protection, even against hospitalization and death. When you're vaccinating during the course of the peak of a wave, and this was our experience last year already when we were doing the AstraZeneca vaccine trial, 1 out of every 5 people that have been vaccinated unknowingly are already infected, are actively infected with the virus at the time of vaccination.
Right.
But it would be completely asymptomatic. And few of them would then go on to progress, to develop symptomatic COVID, and unfortunately a few might actually die. But that is not because the vaccine is causing the COVID, but rather they've already been incubating the virus, although being asymptomatic at the time they were vaccinated. And then the illness takes its natural course in a few.
All right. So yesterday the president also spoke about a focus on people of high risk, that is those over 60, comorbidities, that kind of thing. So why are we testing on children?
Yeah, that's a good question. And certainly in the immediate future, the focus for South Africa and all other countries, in fact, even the United States and United Kingdom, needs to be centered around vaccination of adults and especially high-risk individuals, because the greatest benefit of this vaccine in the immediate future is ability to protect against severe disease and death. And children, although a handful of them might end up in hospital, it's extremely, extremely uncommon, despite them being equally susceptible to being infected with the virus. Nevertheless, it's very few that end up in hospital. So why are we testing the vaccine in children? The vaccine that's being tested in children in South Africa is the Sinovac vaccine. And as you indicated, it's being tested in children for as young as 6 months of age onwards. So the only reason you're wanting to test the vaccines is that in some time in the future, it might be that you're actually wanting to vaccinate children so that you can bring about further reduction in the transmission of the virus. Because if people are protected against being infected, they're less likely to transmit the virus. But does that mean that South Africa are going to actually use COVID-19 vaccines in children anytime soon? I would be highly surprised. And in fact, we shouldn't be using it. at least until 80 to 90% of people above the age of 50 who are most likely to end up in hospital and die from COVID-19 are vaccinated. But there might be a time in the future that we're wanting to use a vaccine in younger children. Whether it goes down to as young as 6 months, that is extremely young. And again, I think there's more of a case to be made in terms of evaluating these vaccines in the 12 to 18 months age, 12 to 18 year age group than in a 6 month to 5 year age group. But that is the prerogative of the company to decide how it wants to develop its vaccine. And obviously, these companies have got approvals, both from the Ethics Committee in South Africa as well as the regulatory authority, SAPRA.
So whilst children might not be high risk, they are potential carriers and infectors. And for as long as there are many children out there infected, could that then be a contributing factor towards creating variants?
Certainly. But again, I think at the end of the day, the immediate goal is not about trying to minimize variants. The immediate goal is to try to save lives and prevent overwhelming of our healthcare facilities. But the larger the pool of unvaccinated people, the more virus there's likely to circulate, which means there's a greater chance that the virus will undergo mutations and that you would have further evolution of variants. So we can reduce the rate of evolution of the variants, not get rid of it completely, but we can reduce the rate of it by reducing the amount of virus that's circulating. And certainly in that context, vaccination of children as a medium-term goal would be reasonably important, but not as an immediate goal, at least not the rollout of the vaccines. But in the meantime, if we are wanting to, as an example, start introducing vaccines in children in a year from now, by then we needed to have gathered the information about the safety of the vaccines and how all the vaccines work in the children. And the time to do that is before you start planning on using the vaccines at the grand scale.
All right. I suppose in comparison then, when I think of a country like Denmark, I think they've vaccinated about 73% of the country. They can start now thinking about children, whereas we're way behind that curve, and all hands on deck should be, first those that are high risk and then the other age groups.
Absolutely. And there is another dimension which actually argues against even countries such as Denmark, the United States, and United Kingdom vaccinating too young children. And that's an issue as to how that impacts on access to vaccines, especially access for countries that have really struggled to gain access. Because as soon as we start using vaccines in children, that means there's going to be less vaccines that's going to become available to other low and middle income countries that have not even vaccinated 2% of their population. So it's also about an equity issue in terms of distribution of vaccines. And the more vaccines that are used in children, the less vaccines are going to become immediately available in other countries that are struggling to vaccinate their high-risk individuals.
Are you a little bit more optimistic about where we are now in terms of our rollout program and where we're going?
Absolutely. I think having administered 14 million doses of vaccine, I think that's an important step moving forward. Unlikely that we're going to get to 40 million doses by the end of the year. But I don't think that's a complete train smash, provided that we can still focus our attention. So even though it's welcome that we've expanded the age group that are able to access vaccine, what we can't lose sight of is focusing on the priority group. And the priority group still remains people above the age of 50. And in fact, anyone above the age of 35 with underlying medical conditions. We need to be able to vaccinate at least 90% of those individuals at least a month before the next resurgence, which is anticipated in December. And that will assist us in minimizing the number of hospitalization and deaths that occurs when we do experience another resurgence, which is almost inevitable.
Very soon, we're going to be in a situation where people like me who've been vaccinated already, a year will pass and we still haven't vaccinated a good number of people. Should they then become the priority and I have to wait for a booster shot if that question ever arises?
Absolutely. If we don't have enough vaccine, the priority should be to get at least a single dose of vaccine into the arms of many people as possible. More so in a country such as South Africa, where all indications are that 70% of people have probably already been infected with the virus. And in that situation, in fact, there's a very nominal benefit from a second dose of vaccine, including the Pfizer vaccine. You would get as good, if not a better response in a person that's been previously infected with a single dose of its Pfizer vaccine compared to 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine in someone that hasn't been previously infected. So the priority in South Africa, if vaccine supply is an issue, is to ensure that we get as many people vaccinated with a single dose, and even a single dose of vaccine provides high level of protection. The Pfizer vaccine provides high level of protection against severe disease and death. So if your second dose is being delayed, I wouldn't lose too much sleep around that. It's really to ensure that we maximize penetration of vaccine, at least a single dose, especially into the arms of high-risk individuals.
Has any work been done? Because I read something somewhere where they said that one of the ways of boosting immunity might be to get a booster shot from a vaccine of vaccines that you didn't use before. Could that be a route that we follow, or still not enough is known as yet?
No, there's mounting evidence which actually indicates that might be the way forward, and especially a combination of what is referred to as the non-replicating vaccines. The example of that is the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, followed by the messenger RNA vaccines, which would be the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. So the studies currently have mainly been done for AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and the experience from those studies is that people that start off with the AstraZeneca vaccine followed by the Pfizer vaccine mount as good, if not a better immune response than people that receive 2 doses of the same vaccine. So that sort of combination, starting off with what is referred to as this non-replicating vector-based vaccines, the J&J and the AstraZeneca vaccine, followed by the messenger RNA vaccines, probably is the way to go from an immunological perspective. There's a recent study which now also reports on the effectiveness of such a schedule, which is very favorable. So I think it makes perfect sense for us to be thinking, moving in that direction, including in South Africa, where all indications are that although in the immediate term, the J&J vaccine probably provides about 60 to 70% protection against hospitalization. If you're wanting to enhance that, the best way to probably enhance it would be to boost with the Pfizer vaccine. So we would need to think of that combination quite seriously, even in South Africa.
All right, but that's still sort of a medium-term goal. In the short term, is there anything that we could be doing better, even though we've picked up pace and seem to be going in the right direction? Is there something that still concerns you?
I think we're getting better in taking vaccine to the people rather than still experimenting with the EVDS system and a whole lot of other policies which were really impediments to getting vaccines into the arms of people, like limiting people that were not on a medical insurance from going to private facilities. So all of those sort of roadblocks have been removed. And now it's really about continuing our efforts to take vaccines to the people, having vaccine points at the SASA pay points, taking vaccines to religious gatherings. We really need to up that game. And provinces such as Limpopo have done a marvelous job, and now the Western Cape and others are really sort of stepping up and taking vaccines to the people, and that is what is going to get us over that threshold of getting at least 80 to 90%. I think once we start taking vaccines to the people, we will realize that although there is some vaccine hesitancy in South Africa, much of the reason for under-immunization currently is more an issue of people not getting readily access to vaccines rather than simply not wanting to be vaccinated.
Professor Mahdi, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for your insights and your time this evening. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, that was Professor Shabir Mahdi speaking to us about the use of vaccines, particularly in children. He says that this perhaps is a medium-term goal and not one that we should be worried about in the immediate term. What we need to do is to get those people that are at high risk vaccinated as quickly and as fast as possible to make sure that we build up the potential to protect as many people as possible.